A city is burning. You can hear the screams through the smoke. Women running through narrow streets clutching children. Soldiers fighting in doorways, overwhelmed, outnumbered. Flames climbing the walls of palaces that took generations to build. And somewhere in the chaos, a king watches everything he knows turn to ash. But here's the thing. This isn't one city. This is dozens of cities, burning at the same time, in different countries, on different continents, over the same 50 years. Mycenae, destroyed. Hattusa, abandoned. Ugarit, burned to the ground. Troy, leveled. Babylon, collapsing. Egypt, barely surviving. In less than a single generation, 8 civilizations that had dominated the known world for centuries simply vanished. Empires that had stood for 500 years crumbled into dust. Writing systems that had recorded history for millennia were forgotten. Technologies that had taken centuries to develop disappeared, as if they had never existed. This was the Bronze Age collapse, the greatest civilizational catastrophe in human history. And here's the strangest part. After 3,200 years of research, archaeology, and scientific analysis, nobody knows exactly what happened. Nobody knows who was responsible. Nobody can fully explain how the entire civilized world could fall apart so completely, so quickly, so permanently. But we have clues. We have theories. We have evidence buried in burned ruins and desperate letters baked in clay. And when you piece it all together, a picture emerges. A picture that looks disturbingly familiar. To understand what was lost, you need to see what existed before. You need to travel back 100 years before the destruction, to the height of an era so sophisticated that it makes our assumptions about the ancient world look foolish. The year is 1300 before Christ. The Mediterranean and Near East are home to a network of civilizations so interconnected, so advanced, so powerful that historians call them the Club of Great Powers. Think of it like the G8 of the ancient world. Egypt was the superpower. The land of the pharaohs had already been building pyramids for over 1,000 years. Ramesses II was constructing monuments so massive they would still be standing 3 millennia later. Egyptian gold flowed across the known world. Egyptian grain fed entire nations. Egyptian power was unquestioned. The Hittites controlled Anatolia, what we now call Turkey. They were warriors, diplomats, and innovators. They had figured out how to work iron centuries before anyone else. They fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, the largest chariot battle in history, and then did something remarkable. They made peace. A peace treaty that would last for generations. The Mycenaeans ruled Greece. These were the Greeks of legend, the warriors of Troy, the people of Achilles and Agamemnon. They built massive palaces with walls so thick that later Greeks believed only giants could have constructed them. They had writing, they had bureaucracy, they had art that still takes your breath away. Babylon was the intellectual center of the world. Babylonian mathematicians calculated the movements of stars. Babylonian doctors treated diseases. Babylonian scribes recorded everything in cuneiform on clay tablets that would survive for thousands of years. Assyria was the military machine of the north. Cyprus was the island of copper, essential for making bronze. Ugarit was the trading hub where all routes converged. Canaan was the crossroads where Africa, Asia, and Europe met, and all of them were connected. Ships crossed the Mediterranean carrying copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, gold from Nubia, amber from the Baltic, lapis lazuli from Iran, perfume from Arabia, wine from Greece, linen from Egypt. Trade routes stretched for thousands of miles. Merchants spoke multiple languages. Diplomats traveled between courts carrying letters in which kings addressed each other as brother. It was globalization, 3,000 years before we invented the word. The Bronze Age economy worked like this. Bronze, the metal that defined the era, required copper and tin. 90% copper, 10% tin. But here's the problem. No single region had both metals in abundance. Cyprus had copper, but no tin. The tin came from places as far away as Afghanistan and Britain. Everyone needed everyone else. The system worked because the system was connected. It was sophisticated, it was efficient, it was prosperous, and it was incredibly fragile. The first signs that something was wrong came from the sky. In 2025, scientists published a remarkable study. They had analyzed ancient trees from Turkey, logs that had been buried for almost 3,200 years. By examining the growth rings, they could reconstruct the climate of the late Bronze Age with unprecedented precision. What they found was chilling. In 1198, 1197, and 1196 before Christ, central Anatolia experienced a severe drought. 3 consecutive years of failed rains, 3 years of withered crops, 3 years of empty granaries, right in the heartland of the Hittite Empire. This wasn't a minor dry spell. This was catastrophic. We have the letters to prove it. Clay tablets found in ancient archives, preserved by the very fires that destroyed the cities, contain desperate pleas between kings. One letter found at Ugarit reads, "There is famine in our house. We will all die of hunger." The Hittite king wrote to the pharaoh of Egypt, his former enemy, begging for grain shipments. And Egypt complied. For the first time in history, Egypt sent food aid to the Hittites. That's how bad things had gotten. Rivals who had fought the largest battle of the ancient world were now trying to keep each other alive. But it wasn't enough. The drought lasted too long. The reserves ran out. The irrigation systems couldn't compensate. Harvests failed year after year. And when people are starving, they don't stay put. They move. They migrate. They do whatever it takes to survive. Empires can survive a drought. They can survive a famine. They have reserves. They have bureaucracies designed to manage crises. But empires cannot survive when everything goes wrong at once. When famine combines with invasion, when earthquake combines with rebellion, when economic collapse combines with mass migration. And that's exactly what happened, because while the crops were failing, something else was moving across the Mediterranean. Something the ancient texts describe with fear and confusion. Something that Egyptian scribes gave a name that has haunted historians ever since. They called them the Sea Peoples. Around 1207 before Christ, Egyptian records begin mentioning attacks by peoples unknown to them. Strangers from across the sea. Raiders who appeared without warning and destroyed everything in their path. The names are strange. Peliset, Cheker, Shekelesh, Denayan, Weshesh. Names that meant nothing to the Egyptians, peoples they had never encountered before. We have pictures of them. Carved into the walls of the temple at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Rameses III, there are detailed reliefs showing these mysterious invaders. Warriors wearing horned helmets, soldiers carrying long swords and round shields, men fighting from ships with high prows, women and children in ox carts, traveling with the armies. And here's the mystery that has consumed historians for over a century. Nobody knows where they came from. Were they from the Aegean? Some scholars think the Peliset might have been the Philistines, who would later settle in Canaan. Were they from Sicily? The Shekelesh might have been Sicilians. Were they from Sardinia? From Anatolia? From somewhere else entirely? The truth is, we don't know. We might never know. But there's an even more disturbing theory. What if the Sea Peoples weren't foreign invaders at all? What if they were refugees? Think about it. The Mediterranean world was collapsing. Crops were failing. Cities were starving. Trade networks were breaking down. What do desperate people do when their world falls apart? They move. They flee. They take to the sea, looking for anywhere that might have food, safety, survival. The Sea Peoples might have been the victims of the collapse, turned into its instruments. Climate refugees transformed into raiders by desperation. Former citizens of dying civilizations with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to go. Whatever they were, wherever they came from, they were devastating. In 1207 before Christ, they attacked Egypt. Ramesses II managed to repel them. Egypt survived that first wave. But the Sea Peoples didn't stop. They moved along the coast, attacking city after city. And everywhere they went, they left destruction so complete that cities were never rebuilt. This wasn't conquest. Conquerors want to rule what they capture. They want wealth and slaves and territory. The Sea Peoples seemed to want none of that. They destroyed and moved on, as if they were fleeing something, as if stopping meant dying. They were the symptom, not the cause. The visible face of a collapse that was already underway. But they accelerated everything. They cut the trade routes, they burned the ports, they severed the connections that had held the Bronze Age world together. And they weren't even the only disaster. The earth itself was turning against civilization. Between 1225 and 1175 before Christ, the eastern Mediterranean was hit by what geophysicists call an earthquake storm, a series of major earthquakes clustered in time and space that devastated the region over a 50-year period. The science is straightforward. The Aegean sits at the meeting point of several tectonic plates. These plates build up pressure over time, and that pressure can be released in sequences. One earthquake triggers stress changes that lead to another earthquake, and another, and another. Archaeological evidence shows earthquake damage at site after site from this period. Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes, Knossos, Medea, walls collapsed, buildings flattened, destruction that fire alone cannot explain. Now, earthquakes by themselves don't end civilizations. Cities rebuild, people adapt. Japan has survived countless earthquakes and remained a functioning society. But here's the difference. When an earthquake hits a stable society, neighbors help with reconstruction. Trade brings resources for rebuilding. Governments organize relief efforts. When an earthquake hits a society that's already starving, already being raided, already losing its trade connections, already struggling to maintain order, there's nobody to help. The resources don't exist. The government is fighting for its own survival. Each disaster made the others worse. The drought caused famine. The famine caused migration. The migration became invasion. The invasion disrupted trade. The trade collapse prevented earthquake recovery. The earthquake damage weakened defenses against the next attack. It was a cascade, a system failure. Dominoes falling across the entire Mediterranean. And the great powers of the Bronze Age started falling with them. The Hittites were the first to go. For 500 years, they had been one of the most powerful empires on earth. From their capital at Hattusa in central Anatolia, they controlled vast territories. They had defeated every enemy. They had mastered iron when everyone else was still dependent on bronze. They had gone toe-to-toe with Egypt and emerged as equals. Hattusa was a wonder of the ancient world. 20,000 people lived within its massive walls. Temples rose to honor 1,000 gods. Libraries held thousands of clay tablets recording laws, treaties, rituals, and history. The Lion Gate welcomed visitors through walls so thick they seemed eternal. But nothing is eternal. The letters from the final years of the Hittite Empire tell a story of mounting desperation. Pleas for grain, reports of raids, requests for military assistance that went unanswered because everyone else was fighting their own battles. The last Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, seems to have won a naval battle against the Sea Peoples around 1210 before Christ. But it didn't matter. The empire was already dying from within. The harvests had failed too many times. The trade routes were cut. The peripheral regions were breaking away. Sometime around 1180 before Christ, Hattusa was abandoned. And then it burned. We don't know if enemies burned it or if the last inhabitants set the fires themselves. But here's the haunting detail that archaeologists discovered. Before the city was abandoned, someone systematically removed the cult statues from every temple. They took their gods with them. They knew they weren't coming back. The Hittite Empire, which had stood for 5 centuries, vanished so completely that for 3,000 years, humanity forgot it had ever existed. The Hittite language became incomprehensible. Their writing was lost. Their achievements were erased from memory. Only in the 20th century did archaeologists begin to piece together who they had been. A superpower, gone, as if it had never existed. Across the Aegean Sea, the Greeks were dying too. These weren't the Greeks you read about in philosophy books. This was 300 years before Socrates, 500 years before Alexander. These were the Mycenaeans, the warrior culture that Homer would later immortalize in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Mycenae itself was a fortress city, perched on a rocky hilltop in southern Greece. Its walls were so massive, built of stones so huge, that later Greeks believed only the Cyclopes could have constructed them. Through the famous Lion Gate, visitors entered a world of wealth and power. Gold death masks covered the faces of kings. Frescoes decorated palace walls. Scribes recorded inventories in a script called Linear B. These were the people who destroyed Troy. The siege of Troy, if it happened, occurred around 1200 before Christ. The Mycenaean warriors were at the height of their power. One generation later, they were gone. The palaces burned. Pylos fell first, then Tiryns, then Mycenae itself. One by one, the great centers of Mycenaean civilization were destroyed. The population scattered. The cities were abandoned. And here's what haunts scholars most. The Linear B script vanished with them. The Mycenaeans could write. They kept records. They had bureaucracy and administration and accounting. And then they lost it. After the collapse, the Greeks forgot how to write. For 400 years, the entire Greek world was illiterate. We call it the Greek Dark Ages because literally nothing was written down. When writing returned to Greece around 800 before Christ, it was a completely different system. The Greek alphabet, borrowed from the Phoenicians. Linear B was dead. The people who rediscovered how to write had no idea that their ancestors had once possessed the same skill. 4 centuries later, a poet named Homer would sing of the heroes of Mycenae: Achilles, Agamemnon, Odysseus. But by then, they were legends. Myths from an incomprehensible past. The Greeks who listened to Homer had no idea how to build the palaces their ancestors had lived in. They looked at the ruins and assumed gods or giants must have created them. That's what was lost. An entire civilization, reduced to myth within a few generations. On the coast of what is now Syria, there was a city called Ugarit. It was one of the richest ports in the ancient world, the crossroads where trade routes from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Aegean all converged. Merchants from a dozen nations walked its streets. Multiple languages filled its marketplaces. Its scribes invented one of the world's first alphabets. In 1929, a farmer's plow struck something buried in his field. That discovery led archaeologists to the ruins of Ugarit, untouched since the city was destroyed around 1185 before Christ. And in those ruins, they found letters, clay tablets preserved for 3,000 years, messages frozen in time at the moment of catastrophe. One letter was found still in a kiln. It had been placed there to be baked hard, to be made permanent, to be sent to another king. But it never left the kiln. The city was destroyed while the clay was still drying. This is what it said. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. A king, writing to his ally in Cyprus, explaining that he cannot defend his own city because his forces are elsewhere, fighting other battles in a war on every front. There was a response. The king of Cyprus wrote back, offering advice and assistance. That letter was also found in the ruins of Ugarit. It had arrived after the city fell. It was never opened. Think about that for a moment. A desperate plea for help, frozen in clay. A response sent with good intentions, arriving too late, lying unopened in the ashes for 3,000 years. Ugarit burned. Its alphabet was forgotten. Its people scattered or died. The city was never rebuilt, never resettled. For 3 millennia, it lay silent beneath the soil, waiting to tell its story. By 1177 before Christ, the world was on fire. The Hittites were gone. The Mycenaeans were collapsing. Ugarit was ashes. The trade routes that had connected civilizations for centuries were severed. The Sea Peoples had destroyed or destabilized nearly every coastal city in the eastern Mediterranean. Only one great power still stood: Egypt. And the Sea Peoples were coming for it. This time, They came in force, not just ships, ox carts carrying families, women and children traveling with the warriors. This wasn't a raid, it was a migration, an entire population on the move, looking for a new home, willing to fight for it. Ramesses III, Pharaoh of Egypt, knew they were coming. He had time to prepare. He gathered every soldier he could find. He positioned archers along the banks of the Nile. He assembled his fleet at the river's mouth. Egypt would not go quietly. The Battle of the Delta, in 1177 before Christ, was one of the most significant military engagements in ancient history. The Sea Peoples sailed into the Nile Delta and found the Egyptian army waiting for them. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show what happened next. Egyptian archers raining arrows on enemy ships, hand-to-hand combat in the shallows, bodies falling into the water, ships capsizing. The Sea Peoples, who had seemed unstoppable, who had destroyed civilization after civilization, met their match. Egypt won. The reliefs show piles of severed hands, the traditional Egyptian way of counting enemy dead. The Sea Peoples were slaughtered, but victory came at a cost. Egypt had survived, but Egypt was exhausted. Ramesses III would be the last great pharaoh of the new kingdom. After him, the decline would be irreversible. Civil wars, corruption, division. Within a century, Egypt would split into rival kingdoms and never again reach its former glory. The survivors of the Sea Peoples scattered. Some settled along the coast of Canaan, the Peliset. We know them better by the name the Bible would later give them, the Philistines, the people who would give their name to Palestine, the eternal enemies of Israel. They were all that was left of a wave of destruction that had remade the world. By 1100 before Christ, the ancient world was unrecognizable. The great civilizations that had flourished for centuries were gone or crippled. The trade networks that had connected continents were severed. The technologies that had built palaces and written histories were forgotten. It's difficult to overstate how much was lost. Writing. Multiple writing systems simply vanished. The Mycenaeans forgot Linear B. The scripts used across Anatolia disappeared. For vast regions of the Mediterranean, literacy itself became a lost art. Trade, the international commerce that had brought tin from Afghanistan and amber from the Baltic and gold from Nubia, simply stopped. For centuries, people would live and die never encountering goods from beyond their immediate region. Technology. Construction techniques that had raised massive walls and complex palaces were forgotten. Metalworking skills declined. Artistic traditions were lost. People who had lived in palace complexes were reduced to living in huts. Cities, urban populations collapsed. Some estimates suggest that certain regions lost 90% of their population. Cities that had housed tens of thousands of people were abandoned to weeds and time. This is what historians call the Bronze Age Dark Ages. And it wasn't just a metaphor, it was literally dark because no one was writing things down. For 300 years in Greece, we have almost no written records. We have to piece together what happened from archaeology alone. Generations were born, lived and died in a world that had forgotten what it had once been. Children grew up among ruins they couldn't explain. Stories were told of great kings and great wars, but they became legends, then myths, then half-remembered dreams. When civilization finally returned centuries later, it was different. The classical Greeks who built the Parthenon were not the same people as the Mycenaeans who had built the Lion Gate. The Phoenicians who spread their alphabet across the Mediterranean were not the same as the merchants of Ugarit. The connections were broken. The continuity was lost. Something new grew from the ashes, but something old was gone forever. So what happened? After 3,200 years, what do we actually know? We know there was severe climate change, drought, failed harvests, famine. We know there were invasions. The Sea Peoples, whoever they were, destroyed city after city. We know there were earthquakes, a storm of seismic events that damaged infrastructure across the region. We know there was systemic collapse, trade networks failing, governments losing control, social order breaking down. But here's what historian Eric Klein argues in his book 1177 BC. The year civilization collapsed. No single factor caused the collapse. It was the combination, the perfect storm. A drought might not have destroyed the Hittites if they hadn't also been fighting invaders. The Sea Peoples might not have been so devastating if the economies they attacked hadn't already been weakened by famine. The earthquakes might have been survivable if neighboring kingdoms had been able to send aid. Each disaster made the others worse. This is what systems theorists call a cascade failure. When a complex system is stressed at multiple points simultaneously, it doesn't degrade gracefully. It collapses suddenly and completely. The same dynamic that brought down the Bronze Age civilizations has been observed in financial markets, power grids, and ecosystems. And that brings us to an uncomfortable question. Look at our world today. Climate change is disrupting agriculture and causing mass migration. Supply chains that span the globe are vulnerable to disruption. Political instability is rising in multiple regions. A pandemic just demonstrated how quickly normal life can unravel. We're not saying civilization is about to collapse, but we are saying that people in 1200 before Christ probably weren't expecting their world to end either. The Hittite kings who wrote those desperate letters asking for grain had ruled an empire that had stood for 500 years. The Mycenaean princes who died defending their palaces had grown up believing their world was permanent. They were wrong. The Bronze Age collapse is a reminder that complexity is fragile, that interconnection creates vulnerability, that systems which seem eternal can vanish in a lifetime. It's not a prophecy of doom, it's a warning about complacency. The great powers of the Bronze Age thought they were too big to fail. They weren't. But here's the part of the story that often gets forgotten: it wasn't the end. From the ashes of the Bronze Age emerged something new. The Greeks who forgot how to write invented a new alphabet, borrowed from the Phoenicians. The iron technology that the Hittites had hoarded became widespread, because the trade secrets died with the empire. Iron was more abundant than bronze, more accessible. It democratized metalworking in a way that bronze never had. The great palaces fell, but what replaced them eventually were city-states, places like Athens, Sparta, Rome. The political experiments that would give birth to democracy, to philosophy, to the foundations of Western civilization. Would Socrates have existed if Mycenae had survived? Would we have Plato, Aristotle, Alexander? Would we have the same history at all? Some scholars argue that the collapse was necessary, that the old order had to die for the new one to be born, that the fires that destroyed the Bronze Age palaces cleared the ground for something different to grow. Maybe. But that's cold comfort for the people who lived through it. For the mother in Ugarit who watched her city burn. For the farmer in Greece who forgot how to read the tablets his grandfather had written. For the craftsman in Hattusa who took his gods and fled into a future that held nothing but uncertainty. The progress that eventually came meant nothing to them. They experienced only the loss. A city burns. It could be Mycenae. It could be Ugarit. It could be Hattusa. It could be any of the dozens of cities that fell during those terrible 50 years. In the ruins, a child plays among the broken stones. She doesn't know what this place used to be. She doesn't know about the kings who ruled here, the scribes who recorded history here, the merchants who grew rich here. To her, the fallen walls are just rocks. The burned timbers are just wood. Her grandchildren will tell stories about giants who built impossible cities. Her great-grandchildren will call those stories myths. And eventually, the truth will be buried under 3,000 years of forgetting. But life goes on. It always does. Civilizations fall, but people survive. They adapt. They rebuild. They create something new from the wreckage of something old. The Bronze Age ended in fire. The Iron Age emerged from the ashes. And the cycle continues. We are not immune to history. Our world is more connected than the Bronze Age ever was, which makes us more powerful and more vulnerable at the same time. We have technologies they couldn't dream of, and challenges they never faced. What happens next is not written yet. But the Bronze Age collapse reminds us that nothing is guaranteed, that every civilization, no matter how powerful, is ultimately temporary. That the only constant in human history is change, sometimes gradual, sometimes catastrophic. The cities that burned in 1177 before Christ have a message for us if we're willing to listen. It's not a message of despair. It's a reminder to pay attention, to build resilience, to never assume that tomorrow will look like today. Because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the world ends, and sometimes from the ending something new begins. The only question is what we'll build from here.